And
Just wait till David and Jane get on and have them have to be muted.
That's a must.
we are going to we're now live. We're now recording, and so for those of you that weren't aware that we're recording, we are. So if you do not want to, then you can maybe jump off. But we are recording, but I also want to say that thanks for coming. I'm really excited. My name is Virgil Moorhead Jr. I'm part of the Big Lagoon Rancheria, which is Yurok and Tolowa, and the executive director at Two Feathers Native American Family Services. And before I turn it over to our co-host to introduce our wonderful speaker today, I want to pay honor and respect to the land that I'm currently on, which I'm in McKinleyville. McKinleyville, for those of you that are here from maybe not Humboldt County, is about 5.5, 6 hours north of San Francisco on the Pacific Ocean, and is part of the Wiyot. Originally, the people were the Wiyot. It's Wiyot territory, and so I want to honor and respect the Wiyot people and the land that we're on, which is Wiyot land. And so with that, I'm going to turn over to Julie to talk a little bit more about the event and just providing some structure, and then introduce some of our co-hosts or talk a little bit about the event. Julie.
Great, thank you so much, Virgil. I just want to really thank you for all your work on this event. And I want to just thank the organizations that are sponsoring this event this evening. We have Two Feathers Native American Family Services and the Northern California Indian Development Council with Rain Marshall, and then the Mattole Valley Resource Center in Petrolia. And I'm Julie Simpson. I'm the executive director of the Family Resource Center in Petrolia, and I'm also the project director for the Mental Health Demonstration Grant for Eureka City Schools, which covers all of the Eureka from all of Humboldt County. We're so pleased to have Dr. Robert Putnam here this afternoon. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him, but first I wanted to just let you know about the event. Bob's going to speak for about 20-25 minutes about his new book, which will be followed by a community discussion led by Virgil Moorhead Jr. And then questions from the community. So as Virgil and Bob are having this discussion, please feel free to put any questions you have into the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer them. And again, this session is being recorded. And I want to tell you about our amazing speaker. Robert Putnam is the Malkin Research Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the British Academy, and past president of the American Political Science Association. In 2006, he received the Skite Prize, which is the world's highest accolade for political scientists. In 2012, Barack Obama awarded Bob the National Humanities Medal, the nation's highest honor for contributions to the humanities. Bob's written 15 books, translated into 20 languages, including Making Democracy Work, Civil Traditions in Italy, and Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community, both among the most cited and best-selling social science works in nearly a century. Bob has consulted for Presidents Carter, Clinton, Bush 43, and Obama, as well as presidents and prime ministers from the UK, Ireland, and Finland to South Korea and Singapore. His most recent book, The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again from 2020, is a widely praised study of broad 20th century American economic, social, political, and cultural trends. Thank you so much and welcome, Bob Putnam.
Thanks very much.
Put the slideshow up, give me a sec.
That's fine. Meanwhile, I'll say hello. Thank you all for coming. And thanks to Julie and Virgil for helping to put all this together. I thought that there might have been an earlier slide there. Can we try starting the PPT again? But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we cut the cover slide. Let's see. There, perfect. Thank you. So the reason I wanted this up is because this book, as you can see from the cover on the left-hand side, is co-authored with Shailene Romney Garrett. She's a full co-author, and I'm sorry that she can't be with us today, because a lot of the ideas I'm going to be describing here are at least as much her contribution to the project as mine. Yeah, I'm going to, if you have the next slide, this is going to show you a little bit about my plan for the day or the night. Can we get the next slide up? I think maybe you got to go down to the lower left-hand corner and click something forward.
Sorry, Bob, I'm working on it. I'm having a little bit of trouble with my computer. Give me one.
Yeah, sure, I can understand that. That's natural.
Okay, I think I've got it. Thank you.
Jane, you got to mute yourself there. Hey, give me a second. I'm trying to figure this out, Bob. Sorry.
If you put it up, I can tell you what I can tell you. Put up the slide thing that you just had up for a second, if you can, Julie.
I'm just having trouble with moving it to the next slide, but I think I've got it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here's the first half of what I'm going to say. This is just a quick overview. America today is in a pickle. This is probably the only thing that all Americans agree about. We're in a real pickle. And what I mean by that here, I'm going to show you some statistical evidence that we are in historic levels of political polarization. As I'll show you in a second, we have probably never been as polarized politically as we are now. The only exception to that is actually the period from 1860 to 1865, which you'll recognize, of course, as the Civil War. We're about as divided politically in America today as we were in the run-up to and during the Civil War. We're also, however, independently from that, we're also in an historic period of economic inequality. This is not the same thing as polarization, but the gap between rich and poor has rarely been as great as it is in America today. Possibly never been as great as it is today. So we're suffering from a combination of extreme polarization and extreme economic inequality. And the third dimension I want to talk about, which is social isolation. Americans are about as socially isolated and fragmented today as we've ever been. I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second. And finally, and again, a fourth separate thing, but it all goes together. We're in a period culturally in which America's culture has hardly ever been as self-centered, narcissistic, as we are right now. So the first question is, how did we get here? And then that is going to turn out to lead to the next question and the second half of what I want to say, which is, okay, given how we got here, how can we get out of it? And it's going to turn out that history lesson, that the first half is a history lesson, that's going to lead to some really interesting ideas about how we could get out of this terrible period we're in. But let's first of all look at the hard evidence. And I'm going to go over this quickly because I know this is not an academic talk, but I want you to see that this is not just my private opinion about all these things. We've looked really hard at a lot of very hard political evidence. Hard statistical evidence. Can we have the next slide, please?
Sorry, Bob, I'm struggling to get the slideshow to work, so I'm trying to figure out.
Here, hold on just one second. If you see your little pointer there, go down to the lower left-hand corner. And
thank you very much.
Right down there, that's it. There you are. Perfect. Good. We're going to be fine. So now, everybody, this is a chart. All the charts are going to look sort of like this. But so let me explain how this one is. This is a chart that shows how our politics have changed over the last 125 years. And the horizontal axis is simply time. If you look over the left-hand side, that's the 1890s, and you look over the right-hand side, that's today. So that looks at the last, roughly speaking, the last 125 years, so to speak. And the vertical axis in each of these curves is going to be a measure of one of these four variables that I talked about, politics, economics, society, and culture. And in this case, up means we get along politically, and down means we're very polarized. And so if you start over at the left-hand side of this graph, you can see that in the 1890s, at the period that was called the Gilded Age, actually, we'll see why in a minute, but this is the end of the 1890s. America was exceptionally divided politically. And at the time, we had never been as divided as that since the Civil War, which had been, 30 years earlier. So we were very divided in 1890. But then as you see, coming out of that period, and especially in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, we began to be less divided, more cooperative politically. And it wasn't a steady, absolutely, you can see that it varies a little bit from year to year, but all the way through the 30s and through the 40s and through the 50s, into the 50s. If you stop up there at the moment in the 50s, you can see that there's the highest dot here, the period in which we're the least polarized, and maybe the least polarized in our history in party terms. The president up there was Dwight Eisenhower. A few of you in the audience will remember Dwight Eisenhower, and Dwight Eisenhower, everybody agrees, was the least partisan president in American history, with the exception of George Washington. And in fact, both Republicans and Democrats tried to nominate Ike to be president. It was just a mark of how nonpartisan, how non-political that period was. I'm not saying Eisenhower caused it. On the contrary, Eisenhower was simply a reflection of how unpolarized American politics were. And that sort of continued through the 60s, really. And then until the 70s, you can see suddenly we begin to become more polarized. And going down steadily, we become more and more polarized through the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s and into the 2000 up until 2015 down at the bottom. And if this graph continued, we now know what it looks like after 2015 to 2021. It keeps going down even further. So if this graph were fully complete, it would go down. That's where we would end up. And at that point, we would be more polarized than we were in the 1890s, but even just about as polarized as we were back in the 1860s. This is statistical evidence that I referred when I said before that we were about as polarized as we have ever been. This is what it looks like. But now let's look at economics. That's a separate question, isn't it? And here we're going to look at trends in the gap between rich and poor. So in this case, up means equal and down means unequal. So we begin this graph, it starts in 1913 because that's when the IRS was created, and that's when we begin to have really good hard data, but we know sort of what it looked like before then from other evidence. And at the end of the 19th century, that's the end of the 19th century, which is actually not on the graph strictly speaking, but over there to the left, that's right. In that period there, that was called the Gilded Age. The name talked about was invented actually by Mark Twain, but he was talking about the huge gap between rich folks and poor folks, between the robber barons and the poor immigrants. So that the gap between rich and poor, you could see it on the east side of Manhattan. The lower east side of Manhattan was struggling poor immigrants, barely able to keep body and soul together. And just 8 or 10 miles north on the upper east side of New York were the mansions of the robber barons. That captured this enormous inequality of that period. And we see what that looked like by the time we get to the 1910s on the graph. You can see then, however, that beginning at that point, there starts to be somewhat more equality. Still not perfect equality, of course. We're a long way from perfect equality. There's a dip in the 20s. That's the Roaring 20s when the rich folks did pretty well. But then coming out of that period, steady increases through the New Deal, but then continue through World War II. And even after World War II, we're getting more and more equal. And again, we hit the peak of equality here around 1960. And you can, now up there, I want to be clear, America was not a commune. We did have differences between rich and poor, but relatively speaking, we were very equal. If you think about us in international terms, in that period around 1960, we looked like Sweden. We had very, very small gaps between rich folks and poor folks. And we stayed at that high level of equality for quite a while, through the 50s and into the 60s. And then suddenly, beginning in the 1970s, we begin to plunge like off a cliff. And the gap between rich and poor widens dramatically and keeps going down. The gap, the polarization, the inequality keeps growing up and equality keeps going down, 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 down. It looks in about 2010, maybe we've ended this, but again, we know what happened after that. And that's exactly right. Way down there, because of the Trump tax cuts and because of the pandemic and so on, we're now we are certainly, the distribution of income in America is certainly as bad as it was at the beginning in the Gilded Age, and maybe as bad as it's ever been in American history. So, boy, are we in a pickle. Extremely polarized, politically extremely unequal, economically. Let's turn to society for a minute, the degree to which we're connected with one another, what I sometimes academically call social capital. This just means our connections with other people. And the underlying measures here, there, by the way, there are underneath each of these curves, but this one, for example, underneath this curve, there are a dozen specific measures. So these are really powerful statistical summaries of what was happening. Underneath this graph are measures of things like, well, to what extent do we belong to community organizations, like, you know, bowling leagues or other sorts of community groups, garden groups or book groups or whatever. To what extent are we connected with our neighbors? What's the degree of neighborliness in America year by year? Or what's the degree of membership in church organizations? For a lot of Americans, religion is a pretty big deal. I don't necessarily mean it's a big deal theologically, but it's an important part of their social connections, and so we want to look at that. And that graph looks the same as this. I won't repeat all of these things because I want to get through the data here quickly. Or we could look at things like family structure, the degree to which people are either form families, really whatever the flavor. I know nowadays we have a lot of different kinds of families, but in the early part, in the 1890s, the types of families were a little more straightforward, but they weren't actually. There were a lot of people that were then called spinsters and bachelors. A lot of people went unmarried their whole life, or they got married late, and if they got married at all, they had kids late. So that in that period, the family structure was kind of thin, but then it rose steadily. All of those things began to rise. You can see them here. They rose steadily. There was again a pause in the 1920s, but then that period from about 1935 to 1950 was probably the greatest civic boom in America. In every way, Americans were more and more connected. We joined more groups. We belonged to church organizations more often. We spent more time with our families. We trusted other people more. We were really very coherent at that and cohesive. It was a society that was knit together in lots of specific, measurable ways. But then, gosh, it's beginning to look familiar, isn't it? Beginning in the 1970s, suddenly that turns the other direction, and we plunge downward, 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 downward. And once again, if we kept on this measure runs until 2017. But if we kept going, the same factors we've talked about before, the COVID and all that, would have reduced even more the degree to which we connect with one another. So we're back down to, probably about as bad as we were in terms of social fragmentation as we were 125 years ago. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here we're measuring cultural solidarity, which you might say is the degree to which people feel that we're all in this together. That's high social solidarity, or in which people feel we're all for ourselves. Dog eat, we should be. It's dog eat dog. We should, and I'll say a little bit more about this later. But one way of thinking about this is that over at the left-hand side, in the 1890s, Americans were, I'll say a little bit more about this in a second, but Americans were very focused on the political philosophy of the time, the sort of the main way in which people talked about how society fit together was called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was a fallacious knockoff of Darwin's theory of evolution, but the knockoff said, just like beasts of the field, people are better off if we'll all be better off if some of us are just selfish, and everybody should just look after number one, and that will take the hindmost. That was the dominant philosophy. Everybody should be really selfish, and made it a moral thing. We should all be really selfish. But then in around 1890, between 1890 and 1900, all of a sudden, that was the idea of social Darwinism began to be replaced by something called the social gospel. Now, the social gospel was, in the first instance, you'd get this from the title probably, a philosophy that emerged out of evangelical churches, but it quickly spread across the spectrum, both religiously and politically. And basically, the idea of the social gospel was, and as I repeat, it became secular pretty quickly and spread across all different kinds of religions. The idea was, wait a minute, the moral thing here is to worry about other people. It's not to worry about number one. And so there was a kind of a struggle in that period, exactly where the dot is now, a struggle then between the people who said it's all about me, and the people said, no, it's all about we. It's us. We should be all focusing on our shared values and shared connections and our responsibilities to one another. And what happened was that the latter emphasis, you can see this in the chart there, beginning in around 1900, the emphasis on what we have in common began to accelerate compared to the emphasis on me. And again, there's a little bit of a pause during the 20s, but you can see a steady rise, general rise, more and more emphasis on the we and less emphasis on the I. And again, that hits a peak in the 1960s. If we had a lot more time, I would love to tell you about exactly some of the measures, because we have some neat measures here, but it doesn't matter. If you just trust me for a moment, what we see in the data is that beginning about the mid-1960s, suddenly the worm turns and we stop being we just stop putting so much emphasis in our own lives and in other people's lives on other people, and we start focusing more on me, on I. And that trend or ever increasing emphasis on I and my interests and this sort of narcissism on self-centeredness in our culture, that continues, you can see, uninterruptedly all the way down to where we are now. And by now, I needn't tell you that if we let the graph go to the end, it gets down even further. So now let me quickly put all of these charts together so you see how they all fit together. And then we have the next slide. We call this the I century for obvious reasons. Over at the left-hand side, where the dot is now, during that period, America was very much an I society. We were very unequal. We were very politically divided and polarized. We were very focused. We were not very connected with other people. We were disconnected from other people. And we were very much culturally focusing on I. By the middle of these curves, we were a we society, because then we were more economically equal, less politically polarized, more cooperative politically, more connected socially, and more focused on what we had in common, with a greater sense that we're all in this together. And then, as we go down the other side of this upside down curve, you can see we get steadily, all the curves move the same direction. It's getting a little boring. If we have the next slide, you'll see how it all gets put together. That's basically the data that underlie this study. And you can see, we call that the I century, because it starts off with, over there in the 1890s, with a very self-centered, economically unequal, politically polarized, selfish society. And then, with the exception of that puzzling pause during the 1920s, all of those measures go up. They reach a peak in around the 1960s, and then they turn south, and we end up back in our I society now. Now, if you look at that graph, there are a number of things you can see, but one of the first things that many people ask, maybe you're asking, is, well, Bob, what happened up there at the top? That is, what's the explanation for this reversal up there? And there are a lot of people now who are talking about that question, because there's been stuff written about the right-hand side of this chart. That is, the last 50 or 60 years, there have been writings in the last 5 or 10 years about that, about growing polarization, about growing inequality, about growing self-centeredness, and so on. So we know about that period. And if you pursue those explanations, in a practical way, you're led to a kind of nostalgia. You're led to sort of say, well, wouldn't it be great if we could somehow get back to the period when we were at the high point? And you might even say, let's make America great again. And that wasn't that's not our view at all. First of all, we don't think America was so great up there, because it'll turn out in a second. That's also a period in which there was a lot of racism and in that period up there in the 1960s. And so I at least would never want to recreate that. But secondly, and maybe even more important, we decided that when I say we, I mean Shailene Romney Garrett and I, my co-author and I, decided it was actually less important to see how that upswing ended than to see how it started. And I wanted to see if I can convey to you why we do that and why I'm mostly going to be talking about not what happened on the right-hand side of the graph, but what happened on the left-hand side of the graph. And that is because, and some of you will have seen this coming, if you look over there at the right-hand side, the bottom of the right-hand side in the 1890s, can we point that? If you look over there, those folks were living through exactly the same kind of world that we are today. Go across to where we are now. They were living in our kind of world. And therefore, and we know, you can see it in the graph, we know that they did something that turned things around. They, like us, were caught in a very I-centered America. But they did something, you could just see it in this graph, something that they did set America on a different path. There was a kind of a pivot down at that point when we began to move away from inequality, away from polarization, away from self-centeredness, away from this social isolation, and move in a better direction. And whatever they did back then, around 1900, you can see it very clearly in this graph, whatever they did set America on a path that for the following 2/3 of a century, you know, from roughly 1895 to 1900 up to roughly 1960, 1965, for that 6 or 7 decades, we were doing, they put us on the right track. And then something happened that turned us away. But, you know, if today we could imagine we're stuck over there in 2020 now, and what we want to know is not how could we get back to the 60s, but how could we do what they did back there? Now, there was a name for those folks because what happened at the end of the around the turn of the century, the label for that period in American historiography is called the Progressive Era. And so our book, once you get past the data, our book is aimed to say, what did the progressives do that enabled them to do what we need to do today? Are there lessons then that we can apply to us now? Because if ever there was a period in American history that we could today learn from, it's not the 60s, it's then. Whatever they did, we got to use we can maybe learn from their examples. So if we go to the next slide, I'm here going to very quickly kind of tell you a little bit about some of the lessons from the last time we went through this. These are lessons from that progressive era. And I'm going to try to be quick. I hope that we'll have time during the question and answer period to then go, I know we will, have time to go back into some of the more detailed findings here. But the first thing is you know, if you're a social scientist and you're trying to figure out what's causing what, often you look at what are called lagged or leading variables. That is, if there's some variable of one of those variables that turned first, that began going in the right direction first, you could kind of guess maybe that was the magic bullet, and if we could just do that again, we could figure out how to solve the problem, our problem, because it's the leading variable, leading indicator. And we thought we knew what the leading indicator was. I was sure it was before I did the research. I thought it was economics because I sort of think economics is probably the master variable. So I thought maybe, you know, probably economics changed first and then everything else followed. And that would lead us to some diagnosis as to what to do. The only thing I'm sure about, because they all turned at the same time, almost the same time, the only thing I can be sure about is economic equality is a lagging variable, not a leading variable. And if you think that's unimportant, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for what we do now, because what it says is, if we want to start America on the right track, we shouldn't begin with the economics of it. Economics are an important part of it, but it won't trigger everything else. Something else was the leading indicator back then, and we should be looking for those other variables that were leading indicators if we want to get started. Of course, we will have to begin moving on economic equality too. I'm not at all saying we don't need to worry about economic equality. I'm just saying it shouldn't be our top priority. And so what should be? Well, kind of to our surprise, actually, it turned out that the moral variables, the cultural variables, the sense that we're all in this together or not, that was the leading variable. Those were the leading variables. What came first early on was the defeat of the social Darwinists, you remember them, by the social evangelical folks. They weren't just religious folks, although religion was part of it. But what I'm trying to say is, now turn that into a lesson for now. If we're going to turn this around, our research, turn around where America is now, if we're going to pivot toward a better future for America, it's likely we're going to have to begin, somewhat surprisingly, with beginning to look at our obligations to other people. That's what it means. And it's our obligations to other people that I want to talk about here, because it wasn't just that those folks begin moralizing about the fat cats. That wasn't the crucial thing. They turned their moral gaze on themselves and they said, what have I done to bring us about in this situation? And the fact that they were focused very much on their own responsibilities, the progressive, when I say they, I mean the people leading this movement, the progressive era, the progressive leaders of that period. When I say that they turned it on themselves, I mean all of those activists in that progressive movement were self-critical before they were critical of others. And that is relevant to today. If we're going to have this moral revival, which I think we actually need in America, so that we begin talking about our social problems in moral terms, we can't spare ourselves. Indeed, it would be the kiss of disaster if we began to just focus on other people's problems. It's also on, other people's moral failings. It's ours. Now, I've been using the term progressives, and I have to remind us all here that nowadays the word progressive with a small p really means people on the left wing. But back then, the word progressive with a capital P didn't have that meaning. It did not have a partisan meaning. There were all sorts of people, and it was a nonpartisan movement, so much so that of the candidates for president in 2012, which was right at the height of this, all three of the candidates for presidency in 2012 were all called themselves progressives. The Republican called himself a progressive. The Democrat, who was Woodrow Wilson, called himself a Democrat, and the Independent, who was Teddy Roosevelt, called himself a progressive. So, as I use the word here, progressive doesn't mean just the left wing. It means people. They didn't share all that. These progressives of that era, they disagreed about a lot of things. The one thing they all agreed was things in America had got to change, because we were way on a wrong track. Now, some of them were union members, and so they thought we had to change the structure of labor organizing. Some of them were local government people, and they thought we needed to change the structure of local government. Some of them were people who were focused on monopolies, and they thought we ought to have an antitrust movement. And all these people got bits and pieces. They didn't all agree about everything, but they were all damned determined that we had a moral obligation to turn America in a different direction. A third point I want to make about that period is that they were all young people. This was not a movement of old folks. It was a movement of people. Virtually all of the progressive leaders were in their 20s or younger than their 20s when they did their most important work. We tend to think of them, people like Jane Addams, who was one of the leaders and the founder of Hull House in Chicago. We think of her as an old lady when she got the Nobel Prize for her work as a progressive, and she was then old. But when she was doing the work, she was in her 20s. And that's true across the board. All of these folks in all parts of the progressive movement were young people. And I hope we have a chance later to talk about what the implication of that is for today, because I think that is a powerful implication for America nationally right now, and maybe even for Humboldt County. I'll be quick here. Another thing that people learned during that period was the importance of connecting with other people. Association was the word they used then, and in particular connecting across lines, not just only people of a certain type sticking together, but people from rich folks and poor folks. These were new organizations that formed that linked people across various ethnic and class lines. Another thing that I want to emphasize a lot, and we can maybe get back to this because it's a big deal, was this grassroots movement was a bottom-up, this progressive movement was a bottom-up movement. The really important ideas did not come from Washington, Washington, D.C., and they did not come from Harvard or from Berkeley, or they came from small towns across the middle of America. The best single example, and I've got to do it briefly, but it's astonishing. In that period, in 1910, Americans, for the first time in world history, invented the public high school. Never in world history, and certainly never in America, had anybody had the idea that every kid in town, just by virtue of being a kid, doesn't depend upon his family's wealth, doesn't depend upon how smart he was or she was. If he's a kid or she's a kid in this community, we're all going to pay for free 4 years of secondary education. That turned out to be a dynamite invention, and it went viral. But where did it begin? It began in small towns in the middle of America. It began in little towns in Iowa and Kansas and Nebraska, and spread it to other little towns. This progressive era is an argument for looking to small towns and not the big coastal centers, you know, and not Washington, but to ordinary places. Of course, in the end, it had to, in order to make it really work, you had to go national. But the idea went viral, and from these little towns in the middle of America, it spread to every place in America within 2 or 3 decades. Think of that. An innovation in one little town in Iowa becoming universal across America in 2 or 3 decades, really viral. Last 2 points I will make are important, but I'll not spend as much time as probably as I should. Leadership, political leadership was a lagging indicator here, not a leading. This is not a story in which some brilliant guy on a horse, some charismatic guy sort of says, here's where we're going to go, and leads the way. On the contrary, political leaders in this case, and I think in most really revolutionary cases, political leaders are followers. They look where the parade's going, and then they try to get out in front of the parade and lead it. But this was not from the top down. And the last thing you'd want if you wanted a progressive era, you'll excuse me, the little political thing, is somebody who thinks I alone can fix it. That's the opposite of what fixed it actually in America in this earlier period. And finally, a big deal, and here I really wish I had a lot more time. I've been mentioning the positive lessons from this period. There's one big negative lesson. The progressive era did not, when they began creating this we, it was not a we that was as inclusive as it should have been. It actually did include women, but the we, because that was a period when women got the suffrage movement. So it did largely include women, but it did not include blacks and other ethnic minorities. Big problem. And if we had more time here, I honestly, I devote another half of the talk to that issue. The story is somewhat complicated, and if you're really interested, if you drop me a note, I'll send you a copy of an op-ed that we had in the New York Times a month or so ago that explains the argument about race. Suffice it to say here that if we're going to have another upswing, one of the lessons we learned from the last upswing is we damn well better really mean we, an inclusive we that includes everybody, and not just a select few, not just, for example, white guys. That's a long story, and I've gone on a little too long, Virgil, and but I hope we can come back now to spend some good time on the remaining lessons that might apply specifically to Humboldt County.
Yeah, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation, very focused and compelling argument. And so my sort of first question or follow-up to your presentation is to first off to try to bring your research, your book to the local
Sure.
environment. And recently we the ACLU in collaboration with the NCIDC, who's a co-host of this event, released a report called Failing Grade, the Status of Native American Education in Humboldt County.
Right.
The report outlines in a very compelling manner the ways in which Humboldt schools fail to ensure educational equity for Indigenous students. And so I'm wondering, based on your research and the arguments you make in the book, and really having a whole chapter on race and the American we, like you just mentioned, what do you see as ways that counties such as ours at the local level can improve institutions such as schools to make them more equitable for folks like Native American youth?
That's a big question, as you well know, Virgil, and I'm going to say a couple of things, and then you can push me further on it. First, I've really already said this. We need to focus on a more inclusive sense of we, and that means it means a number of things, but most obviously it means serving all of our youth in America, regardless of their background. And Native Americans are obviously one of the major left out groups in America, but they're not the only, they're one of the smaller but major groups left out. It's also true for Blacks, obviously, and for Latinos, and to some extent it's true for Asian Americans, although the Asian American issue is a little more complicated, as we all know. I'm not saying that the violence against Asian Americans these days is not a real serious problem. It is, of course, a serious problem for all of us. But I mean, on average, Asian Americans are doing somewhat better than other minorities in economic terms. So how do you fix that? Well, the first way you fix it, actually, I think, is to talk about it in moral terms. That's what I've already said. I'm a strong supporter for community organizing. Of course, I'm a strong supporter for community organizing. And I know there's a lot of good community organizing being done up in your part of the world, and that's fabulous. And probably a lot of community organizers on this call right now. And I think community organizing is really important. But community organizers know that community organizing doesn't just mean organizing people to push for things. It means trying to persuade people that it's the morally right thing to do. And that is one thing I would stress a lot. I'm a strong believer, actually, in a lot of the classics of community organizing. But part of that is framing the issue in moral terms so that the people who you're trying to reach can't just brush it off as, oh, this is more pressure group tactics. Secondly, and this is a standard thing that you learn, again, community organizing, I'm just saying stuff that community organizers know. You want to build what in my jargon you call bridging social capital. That is connections that link people to people who are unlike them. So do I think that a bowling league is a good way of connecting people? I do. Do I think it's a good way of bridging? Basically it's not so much, because most people who bowl are like other people who bowl. And there are, bowling is actually big in the Black community in America. I'm using bowling, of course, because I wrote this book called Bowling Alone, and I know a lot about bowling as and not as much as a participant, but as in sociological terms. And the fact is that you can have parallel connection. You can have people organized in a parallel way, but not connected with one another. So you could have Blacks bowling in one alley on one team and whites bowling in another alley, and Native Americans bowling in a different alley. But if they don't actually connect with one another, if they're not on the same team and in the same league, then it doesn't, you don't have the benefits. The benefits of bonding, of bridging social capital, the benefits of it are that you begin to be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes. I don't mean to, I keep using bowling because it's a familiar example to me, and I don't mean to make the whole thing about bowling, but if you're standing up there and you're looking to hit a strike, or you've got a difficult spare to pick up, and the guy who was just up there before you was a Black person or a Native American or something other than you, you've stood in his shoes. I mean, literally, you've stood in his shoes, and that all the data says that's true. Connecting with other people personally is a powerful way to begin to put ourselves in their shoes, and therefore to begin to have them feel that we're also human, if I can put it that way. Okay. The last thing I'd say is school. You don't need me to tell you this. I'm just telling you what the report basically told you. Schools are really important, and they're important for a lot of reasons, because education is important. But the other thing that I want to link to is schools reach youth, and youth I've said before, our evidence from this earlier period is that youth is the big deal. It's almost the whole game. If I could organize, if I had the capacity, I want to change America. I really do want to change America. That's why I'm doing this. That's why we wrote this book, because we want to change America. And if I had a choice between being able to make contact with and motivate, you know, the 90% of America who were, you know, who are in, or let's say 80% who are in there, who are over, who are in their 30s and above, or the 20% who are in their, you know, teens and 20s. I don't have those numbers right, but it's a lot more. I'd pick the smaller group because it's the more powerful group, and for a lot of reasons I didn't have a chance to say. I want to say this again. Youth are crucial, and they're crucial for several reasons. One is they're the ones that are going to stick through it. Secondly, they're the ones who can think new ways out of where we've gotten. I am really concerned about this problem, and I'm old and I can see the problem because I've lived through a different America. I lived through the high point in this, we think, and I can see, I know what America was like, so I can understand the problem, but I can't guess what the new, because I'm just too old. And that's not just true of people who are 80, it's true for people who are, excuse the expression, true for people who are in their 30s, much less people in their 40s and 50s. And so, one, the reason I'm trying to emphasize why youth is such a big deal. One, if you can get the young people, they're the ones who are going to be around to make it stick. And two, they're the ones who are going to have the new ideas that we need. We're not going to get the new ideas from older people. So I put all of my organizing apples in the basket of young people. That's too long and probably didn't answer your question, but that's what I'd say.
Thank you. And before we take, if you want to ask questions, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll ask Bob for questions that you put in the chat. And as a follow-up, you know, one of the things you've said is around about the progressive era is that they were able to engage youth. That youth, they had the passion, the fire to make a better world. And so I'm wondering if there's anything based on your research that we can take today at Humboldt County to be able to engage more youth in making a better world.
So let me try to answer that, although you recognize you guys are living there and you know the kids in Humboldt County, and I don't. So I'm very conscious of my weakness in trying to offer advice. But I do have some ideas, and the most important idea I have is this. The most serious problem facing America today, I'm now speaking about America as a whole. The most serious problem facing America today is youthful cynicism, by which I mean it's not their fault. Let me make that clear. Young people in America did not cause this problem. Indeed, young people in America have never lived through a period in which we didn't have this problem. That's why it's hard for them on their own to think their way out of this, and why it's completely natural to be cynical. They're probably your whole life. We've been on this down. I mean, I'm sure you were born before the 60s, and therefore your whole life you've been living, you didn't know it, but you were living in this downsweep. And that means you and even more younger people than you are almost guaranteed to be cynical. That you have no reason to believe that this could be anything other than it is, because you've never experienced it. But what we're saying from our study of this earlier progressive era is it is possible for young people to get together and can actually change things, because they did. Let me try to say that point in a different frame. It sounds a little jargony. What this story shows is that people, especially young people acting together, have agency. Agency does not mean, what an agency means is that there's no iron law of history that says you've got to go downhill forever and ever. There isn't. It could have been. If you'd been around people who were around in 1910 could easily have said, oh, hell, we're going to hell in a handbasket. We've been going downhill ever since. We can't do anything about this. We're going to just drift along. There was a book written by one of the younger progressives at the time called Drift or Mastery. And he was laying out the options. We can just drift along with history, or we can try to reach out and master history and turn it in a different direction. And so what I'm trying to say to you, and then through you to the young people in Humboldt County, and urging you to say to them, you have a lot of reason to be cynical, but don't be cynical, because what we know is not only that young people who are acting together not only can change the direction of the history of the country and of the community, but it's the only thing that can. The only thing that can do it is them. So I'm putting a big burden on them. It's not going to be older people. It probably, honestly, is not going to be directly you. It's going to be what they do. And the purpose of this book, the fundamental purpose of this book, is to try to overcome that natural cynicism that they would feel and to try to give them a sense of agency. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It makes a lot of sense. And so would you say youth agency then is a leading indicator for a better society?
I would. Now, of course, you know, how you're going to motivate the youth agency, well, somebody's got to get out there and do the work to mobilize them. And those are going to be people who are going to have to be motivated in some way. And so I'm not backing away from saying that think about life in moral terms. I mean, thinking about our obligations to other people in moral terms is a crucial first step. That in a way, but look, even let's take, I'm talking about things right now in America. Suppose you wanted to fix America right now. Suppose you're advising Joe Biden about what should be done right now. Actually, I've had some involvement in advising Joe Biden about what to do right now. And you're worried about both the moral side of this and the, somehow I seem to have lost you, Virgil, but the moral side of this, and you're worried about also the youth side of this. Mm-hmm. So one thing you might do is you might focus on youth service organizations. That is, you might, I mean, things like the Peace Corps, domestic Peace Corps, or there are a whole bunch of programs like that. Voluntary service, in which you give kids, you invite kids to spend a year or two in service to other people, and you, in return, they get, you know, college tuition or something like that. Those programs work. We know they work. I mean, I know a lot about that field, and I'm saying we know they work. They work in part because they're motivating young people, and they work, therefore, for the same reason that I just finished saying, why young people are so important to this whole story. But they also work by convincing young people that moral issues matter. That's what they're out there doing. What they're learning when they're out there is the importance of moral commitments to other people. So it's a twofer. I don't know if you see what I'm trying to say, Virgil. Those service programs, and there must be service programs up there. I mean, up in Humboldt County. And the good news is Biden took my advice and the advice of a lot of other people that I know he got. And there's $1 billion in the American, whatever it's called, American Recovery Plan, the one that's already passed, $1 billion for those sorts of programs across the country. That's exactly what I wanted him to do, and other people wanted to do, and that's what he did. And that means there will be money. I guarantee you there's going to be a lot of money in Humboldt County for getting together young people. Partly they're going to be, you know, clearing trails or whatever. But the AmeriCorps program is going to not just be clearing trails. That's not the real thing that happens when you go through that kind of program. It's not what you do to the building the trails. It's what you do to yourself, and learning about bridging social capital, because you're out there not just with other folks just like you. You got Anglos out there, and if you've set the program up right, you've got Native Americans out there, and you've got people from different backgrounds and people from different political backgrounds. So I've gone on a little long, but that's what I mean when I'm talking about a practical solution that combines the moral training and the youth variable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. So I see we have a little bit of time. We have one question from Clover, and I wanted to take some, questions from the audience. So
yeah, sure.
And maybe just this one. Could Bob explain more about the data that went into the political polarization measure and why he thinks it's changed over time?
Yeah, I'll do it in the next minute. By the way, I am not schedule constrained, but I guess you guys are schedule constrained, so I'd be willing to go a little bit more. But I understand.
A little bit. I can go over a little bit.
Yeah, none of us. We're not talking about going over. Julie, maybe are you saying no? We shouldn't go over. I'm willing to go over a little bit.
It's fine. It's fine with me, Bob.
Okay, so maybe another 10 minutes. How did we measure the trends in political polarization? Well, we used, as in all of those cases, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the person who asked this, and I can't.
Clover?
Clover, okay. I don't see Clover, but hi, Clover. We used many different measures. In every case, we used, all the variables, we used lots of different measures, so we weren't dependent on a particular one. So here are some of the ones we used in the political polarization. One is the degree to which representatives in Congress and in Senate and House vote along party lines or vote across party lines. So that variable right now, it's about 0 because the number of people the number of Republicans who vote with Democrats or vice versa now is essentially 0. That's about as low as you could get in terms of polarization or cooperation. But back at the peak, it was not unusual for 40% of Republicans to vote with 60% of Democrats or vice versa. There was lots of cross-party voting. That's just about disappeared. But also you can measure things like what's called split ticket voting. That is, do ordinary voters choose one party for president and a different party for the House or the Senate. And again, what that would mean is that if ordinary voters are if they're voting a straight ticket, then that's strict party discipline and it's polarized. But if they're voting across party lines, that's a little more, cross-party collaboration. And so that also shows this same trend. Or you can use things like prejudice about, the degree to which the two teams are seen as tribes. And one question that people have asked for a long time is, how would you feel if one of your children married one of the others? You're a Democrat, how would you feel if your child married a Republican? Or you can ask it, how would you, if you're a Jew, how would you feel if your child married a Catholic or a Protestant or whatever? 65 years ago, at the peak of depolarization, I'm doing this from numbers, but about 65% of Americans were upset by cross-religious marriage, and about 5% of Americans were upset by cross-party marriage. Right? Almost nobody thought it was not a big deal if your child married somebody from a different party, but a different religion is a different thing. Now that's reversed. Now about 5% of Americans worry if their child marries someone in a different religion, but about 65 or 70% of Americans are scared to death that their child is going to marry someone from the other party. And so that is another kind of measure. I'm back trying to give you some practical examples of, and there are many others, but those are some examples that we used. They all show the same curve. That's why we're confident it is there. It doesn't much matter whether you use the split tickets or the party personal prejudice or the cross-party voting in Congress, or they all show the same basic pattern. That's maybe more than the person wanted to know, but that's a story about how we measured it.
Thank you. And we have another question on a little bit of a different topic, but important topic, is from Melody Wine. And Melody says, how would the graphs differ if they tracked indicators in Native American communities? What could America learn from Native America in this current time, and sort of the graphs that you showed? And I know you briefly mentioned that it would be different, or would it be with those graphs that you showed for groups such as Native Americans? Yeah.
Well, let me, I'm going to confess my ignorance, of course, but I will try to be a little more specific about my ignorance. There's a tendency for non-Native Americans to think, well, they're all one group, right? All the Native Americans are one group, and so it's all bridging. But, you don't have to know very much about the history of Native Americans to know that's not true. They're different, not only are there different tribes, but they are often in direct conflict to one another. So you can ask the same question about Native Americans as a group. To what extent over time have they thought of themselves as one group, that is a we, or have they thought of themselves as separate groups, right? I don't know, I'm making this up, the Comanches versus the Apaches or something like that. I mean, I know that's a crazy example, but that's what I'm trying to say. And I would almost be certain that that is true even in Humboldt County. I know that there are different people of Native Americans of different tribal origins, and I do not know actually the degree to which there is within the Native American community in Humboldt County a sense that we are all in this together. I kind of guess that by now there is a sense that we're in all this together, but I wouldn't be surprised to learn that that's gone up or down. That is the degree to which, is this making sense? You see what I'm trying to say? And so that's a first interesting question, a way of interpreting the question. But a second way would be, to what extent, how has the role of of Native Americans as a group, how is that in connection with other folks, especially Anglos in Humboldt County, how has that changed over time? That would be an extremely interesting question. And I even know sort of how I certainly know how you can measure it now. You could ask a lot of the same standard questions. How much do Anglos trust Native Americans, and how much Native Americans trust Anglos, or how much intermarriage is there between Native Americans and Anglos, or how much, you could answer those same questions, and maybe even some of those you could get good data on over time, but you certainly could get a sense right now of the degree to which everything that I said, this whole talk, applies to the Native American community in Humboldt County. I know that I have a sense of how inadequate that is because I just don't know enough about the details there, but that's the general answer I would give.
Yeah, well, and one of the questions that I had sent you prior to the talk of, like, you had talked about, and you stated a little bit of Steven Pinker's, argument of society's getting better, our health outcomes are getting better, and one of the things I think for many Native American communities, that our health outcomes haven't maybe got hasn't become better along like Anglo Americans or white folks. And I referenced the Native Americans in Humboldt County. Dying often of those deaths of despair,
absolutely,
unnecessary suffering in this county. And so I think that probably is a little bit where that question is coming from too.
Well, so now I don't want to get too complicated or technical. One issue is whether in absolute terms, the measures of health in Humboldt County among Native Americans, whether that's gotten better or worse over time. And absolute, that is the average life expectancy today of Native Americans or of Native Americans in Humboldt County, is it actually lower than that life expectancy of Native Americans in Humboldt County was 100 years ago? Is it actually lower? And for almost every group in America, that's because there's so much better medicine. We've got vaccines and all antibiotics and a ton of things, and cleaner water and so on. Virtually every group in America is actually, in absolute terms, healthier now. People are living longer. That's a separate question from how different groups have compared to that line. So, for example, we take the case of Blacks, which I know that data very well. Not only are Blacks healthier today than Blacks were, 100 years ago, but Blacks have gotten healthier faster than whites are, so that Blacks have narrowed the gap. It's not just that the trend is up. The African American trend, at least for the first half of the century, was actually going up faster than whites were. And what's happened in the last half century among Blacks, and here's where I know the data, is that stopped being true. That is, it's no longer true that Blacks, now it's true that actually Blacks are not making as fast progress as whites are. So that's and there's one more thing to say about the deaths of despair. It's important to know this. The deaths of despair now in America applies also to poor whites. So what's happening in America today under the heading of deaths of despair is that both blacks and poor whites are losing health, in absolute terms have shorter life expectancy. And so that's a huge big deal. That's why the deaths of despair is such a big deal. It's such a big deal because it's not just that we're not gaining as fast as we used to, we're actually falling behind. Of course, this year we fell way behind because of the pandemic, but for some communities that's been going on. That is, that falling behindness is what's desperately bad. Am I being, I don't want to be too, and so I don't know. At the least, I would bet that the statistics for Native Americans in Humboldt County would show they're not rising faster than everybody else, and they may even be not rising even as fast as everybody else. But maybe this would be the worst possible thing if they're actually getting worse over time, because that I've got to make that. I hope you see it's bizarre that our health is getting worse over time because medicine is constantly getting better. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
So it's a good case. This is a good case where I want to ask you. You tell me the.
Well, I think an important point of what you talked about is being able to sort of, it's like your colleague at Harvard, William Julius Wilson talked about the working poor and maybe the middle class blacks are going to be getting better, but the poor aren't. And so I think it's important to, when you talk about natives in this area, that to look at I think that
absolutely, but first of all, I completely agree with that. Bill Wilson and I happen to be good friends personally because we're both at Harvard, but it's all quite apart from that. He and I agree completely about this, that there's this growing gap within the black community and within the white community, actually. It's a growing class gap. And if that's also true within the Native American community, it's quite interesting because that's a common pattern. That's also true among Asian Americans. It's true among Latinos. This growing gap within a class gap within and to the extent that that's true, it really is kind of interesting because it says we shouldn't just be focusing on ethnicity. We should be focusing on class too. Because if we just focus on ethnicity and ignore class, well, then maybe we'll get more black, doctors or professionals of some sort, more black lawyers, but the rest of the black community is going to be getting worse. Mm-hmm. And that is exactly what's happening in the black community. It's what's happening in the Asian American community. It's what's happening in the white community. And in a sense, that creates an interesting opportunity for novel, this is really important, for novel alliances, because it means that there ought to be a kind of an alliance between advocates for, I'm taking your case, advocates for Native Americans and advocates for poor whites in Humboldt County. Now, I don't know that much about Humboldt County, so I don't know for sure that there are poor whites. Maybe all the whites in Humboldt County are rich, but if not, then there's a latent alliance. You see what I'm trying to say? A latent alliance there that you ought to be alert to. Maybe you are, because I bet you guys are more sophisticated than I am, but a lot of people around America, a lot of advocates for minority groups don't realize quite that actually some of their best allies would be poor like them, but white.
Yeah. For the natives that, maybe are on the lower socioeconomic, that are the ones that are often struggling more. Yeah. And I see we're about time, so I know I wanted to give you one last, any statements, I know your book, or at least I took your book and your work is about hope, is about, saying that we can come up with some solutions to the ills that are plaguing us during these times. And so I want to leave the floor to you to talk about any last comments or things you'd like to say.
Well, several things I want to say last. I want to say thanks to you, Virgil. This has been a terrific, you've posed a terrific set, you and your colleagues there have posed a terrific set of questions. I've done probably 100 of these events like this around the country in the last 3 or 4 months, and this has been one of the liveliest, most interesting discussions that I've been in. And that's entirely your responsibility and the responsibility of the other folks here. So I want to thank you for that. I want to say to Julie, who is, as probably most of you know, a kind of a distant relative of mine, and who I want to say, Julie, I hope I didn't embarrass you, because I have enormous admiration, not only for you as something like second cousin twice removed or something like that. I don't actually even know exactly what our relationship is, but it's been great being here. And then finally, I do want to say something substantive, because actually, Virgil, you may or may not know this, this book was entirely written and off at the publishers in January 2000. That is, this book was written knowing nothing.
Not 2000.
2020. This book was written knowing nothing about the pandemic, because that was off in the future when we wrote this book. This book was written knowing nothing about the economic collapse of the last year and a bit. This book was written knowing nothing about Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. This book was written about knowing nothing about the political campaign of last year. When this book was written, we didn't know who the Republican candidate was going to be, and we had no idea whether it was going to be closer or not. The book is written knowing nothing about the outcome of the election. It's written knowing nothing about January 6th. It's written knowing nothing about, you know, Biden's plan. But I am actually right now more hopeful as a result of what's happened, way more hopeful than I was when we wrote this book. My view now is much more hopeful, because I think that the events of the last, I don't want to sugarcoat this, the events of the last, whatever it is, 15 months have been terrible. I'm not for a second saying it's not terrible, but they've also kindled a sense of enough already. And oddly enough, a sense that goes across lines, enough already. And I think even a little bit of a sense of moral sense that we can't go on living this way. And I think even a little bit of that, and I admit that this is a little maybe wishful thinking on my part, but I think a little bit of that goes across party lines. Everybody wants to be done with this fighting with each other. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to agree about everything, of course not, and that doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight. But the fact is that I've said this in an op-ed that's going to appear in the New York Times in the next week or so. I am more hopeful about the future of America than I have ever been in my entire life, and I'm 80 years old. And that's because I think for all the pain and suffering that's associated with this pandemic and what's followed, I know I'm not at all blind to that, but I do think it has somehow triggered in us a sense that, you know, in the end, we are all in this together, and we're not going to be able to, you know, fight our way out of this. So that's my last word.
Thank you. That was
so much. Thank you so much, Bob. It's such a pleasure to have you. I want everyone to know you can, Northtown Books has Bob's book if anyone wants to order it. And thanks to everyone that is here in the community participating. And thanks, Bob.
Thanks to all of you.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks. That's Jim, I guess, huh? And did I?
And now we'll have the family reunion.
Yeah, no, I know, but I before we hang up here, I want to know: is there any others? Do I have any other family members who are in the? I thought I saw some other members of our family. And
yeah, my folks, David and Jane, Sierra, Gabby.
Hi.
Oh my goodness.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, all of you.
There's Jane.
Oh my God! And Jane and David is there. Whoa, hi, dude. What a treat.
See you all in August at the reunion.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody. Oh, bye, Sierra.
Hi, Rosemary.
Hi.
Thanks a lot, Bob. It was wonderful.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Rosemary and Bob.
Bye.
Bye.